Shot down, an airliner with nearly 300 souls aboard attacked over Ukraine. GM's top executive in the hot seat. What she told Congress today. Fleeing the fighting, a look at refugees trying to get away from militants in Iraq. And no more peace. The brief ceasefire in the Holy Land is over. We speak directly with Catholic Relief Services on the ground in Jerusalem. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, July 17th, 2014. Good evening, I'm Brian Patrick, and we begin tonight with a terrible tragedy involving yet another Malaysian Airlines plane. 295 people were on board the plane when it crashed in Ukraine. There is no evidence of any survivors. Witnesses say they actually saw the plane being hit by what looks like a rocket. Now, Flight 17 left Amsterdam in the Netherlands on its way to Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia. It was last tracked there in western Ukraine. The crash site is actually in eastern Ukraine, which is about 25 miles away from the border with Russia. This is an area under the control of the Russian militants or pro-Russian militants. President Obama is traveling today, but he is monitoring the situation closely. His top advisors are at work at the White House. Our Jason Calvi joins us from there with coverage tonight. Jason?
Hey, Brian, the president says his top priority right now is to find out if Americans were indeed on that plane. He also says some of his national security team is in touch with the Ukrainian government.
The United States will offer any assistance we can to help determine what happened and why. And as a country, our thoughts and prayers are with all the families of the passengers wherever they call home.
Malaysia Airlines says 280 passengers and 15 crew members were on board. An AP journalist at the crash site counted at least 22 bodies. Both Ukraine and pro-Russian separatists blamed the others for the attack, and both denied shooting down the plane. Ukraine's president called it an act of terrorism and called for an investigation into the crash. An advisor to Ukraine's interior minister posted on Facebook that the plane was flying at 33,000 feet. He said the plane was hit by a missile. AP journalists saw a missile launcher near an eastern Ukrainian town. A Ukrainian official also says a Russian plane shot down a Ukrainian fighter jet yesterday. And it just so happened, Brian, that as the president was in a phone conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin, the news broke that the plane went down. Both of the leaders talked about the issue and also talked about the U.S. sanctions against Russia. Brian?
Jason Calvi from the White House tonight. Thank you. If this plane was indeed shot down, it would be the fourth passenger jet fired on in flight. In 1978, Korean Airlines Flight 902, traveling from Paris to Seoul, strayed over the Soviet Union. An interceptor aircraft fired at the plane. 2 passengers died after a forced landing on a frozen lake. In 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down by a Soviet air-to-air missile. All 269 people on board died. In July 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 from Tehran to Dubai was shot down by the U.S. Navy. The Vincennes, all 16 crew members and 274 passengers were killed. Daniel Coaches joins us from the Heritage Foundation. Now, if a missile did hit this, you're talking 6 miles up. What kind of a weapon would that be, and where would someone get a weapon like that?
Right. As you indicate, this isn't your run-of-the-mill missile launcher. This would be something like an SA-17, which both the Ukrainians and the Russians have. The Russians have moved some of their SA-17s up to the border in recent weeks. There have been some reports on the ground from journalists that the rebels, the pro-Russia rebels, have some of these weapons, and so that seems to be the most likely scenario.
So these are truck-mounted missile launchers. They're not man-held, as they've actually bragged, or the separatists have talked about shooting down Ukrainian military aircraft. Is it possible they mistakenly thought this was a military aircraft?
I think, Brian, that's probably the most likely scenario. As you indicate, about a week ago, a Ukrainian military transport plane flying at 21,000 feet was shot down by pro-Russia separatists. And so it's likely that they thought that this plane was one of the Ukrainian military jets, and that's why they shot at it. But it is, make no mistake, a very advanced system that's going to be able to get up to 33,000 feet.
Yeah, I've heard it would take very special training for this. So if it turns out that Russia did provide that weapon and maybe even the training for it, what kind of repercussions are we looking at?
There needs to be very strong repercussions. Part of the problem has been that the United States has had trouble getting our European allies on board with strong sanctions. We've been very reticent about putting in sort of the damning sector-specific sanctions that would really hurt the Russian economy. And I think that you're going to see really a tidal change in that moving forward.
We must point out that none of this has been proven so far. This is quite a bit of speculation, but that's really all we can do at this point. Now, the FAA had warned American pilots to stay away from that area way back in April. Why would a commercial plane be flying over a war zone?
Well, the regulations, it depends on where the plane is registered for. So a Malaysian Airlines plane would be under the regulations of Malaysia. The United States says not to fly over certain war zones, North Korea, Ukraine, Syria, for instance. But this plane wasn't subject to those same regulations. So unfortunately, it was flying over, and it's a real tragedy because of it.
We can ignore the fact that this is the second Malaysian airliner that has been doomed over the past 6 months. That's just a coincidence?
I think so. I mean, it certainly seems that it's a coincidence that the first airline crash was because of some sort of mechanical failure, and that this second one, it seems the evidence is mounting that it was shot down by someone, likely the separatists. It's an unfortunate coincidence and a tragedy in both cases.
Daniel Coaches from the Heritage Foundation, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brian.
And we will have continuing coverage of this tragedy as we now look at some of the world news that's covered in today's world by our EWTN News Nightly team. The Israeli military has launched a ground operation in the Gaza Strip. The Army says the offensive is meant to strike a significant blow to Hamas terror infrastructure. They're not saying how many troops have been sent into Gaza. This comes just a short time after the so-called humanitarian pause in the fighting ended. Hamas immediately started firing more rockets. Israel retaliated with more airstrikes. Meanwhile, Egypt is still trying to broker peace. The conflict is causing trouble not only for citizens of the Middle East, but also for a Catholic organization that's been serving the region for decades. Matt McGarry is the country representative for CRS, Catholic Relief Services, in Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. He's joining us from Jerusalem via Skype. I wonder what the situation is on the ground right now, Matt. Tell us what it feels like to be there.
Well, here in Jerusalem, there's a relative quiet. We've had a couple of air raid sirens in the last few weeks. There was quite a bit of tension and some widespread demonstrations several weeks ago. But really, the situation right now is most intense and most serious in Gaza and in southern Israel.
Doesn't CRS have an office in Gaza?
We do. We have about 15 Gazan staff there. We have one American staff person who's based there full time, who we brought out last Tuesday. She came back to Jerusalem. Our office is currently closed. It's not safe for people to be moving around in the streets. There have been widespread airstrikes coming in. There have been rocket launches going out. Our team is working from their homes. They themselves are safe. We've had one staff person lost several of her relatives in an airstrike, and one of the participants in one of our programs was killed in her home last week. But our team is safe. They're working from their homes, but it's not safe for them to move around at the moment.
Very tense situation there, and I know there are many immediate needs. What is CRS able to do to respond in the short term, and what are the long-term needs, do you think?
So in the immediate future, within the next day or two, as soon as hopefully there will be some prevailing calm, it'll be possible for us to get back out into the field. We're planning to begin with a distribution of non-food items, so plastic sheets, buckets, hygiene materials, things like that people need who have been displaced, whose homes have been damaged, civilians who have been near airstrike locations, who have had to flee their homes or whose homes have been damaged in some way. A little bit further on, we're hoping to do some voucher and cash transfers. Again, the banking system in Gaza has been non-functional for the last few weeks, and so just access to basic resources have become increasingly difficult for many, many families.
All right, Matt McGarry joining us from Jerusalem with Catholic Relief Services. Matt, be assured of our prayers for the safety of your family, your staff, and all those in harm's way there.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that.
Meanwhile, tens of thousands of refugees have traveled for days across northern Iraq to escape the ISIS militant onslaught. Our Catherine Zeltner has that story.
Benin and her twin Aya will never know their father. They were born in a stranger's home while their mother Fatima was on the run. When she was barely 2 months pregnant, her husband of 9 years, a soldier in Mosul, was killed by insurgents last year before ISIS fully took over. The militant group replaced the Shia flag over one of the shrines with their own. That's when her father-in-law knew Mosul was no longer home.
What am I supposed to do? My son died. It's tragedy after tragedy. You know, I was building him a house, a whole house. It was almost finished. I had all the faucets installed.
Many make the journey from ISIS-controlled areas in northern Iraq by road. What should be a 10-hour drive becomes a harrowing journey of 4 to 7 days. But at least here in Iraq's Shia heartland, they are safe. So far, some 23,000 and counting have arrived. The twins' cousin lying next to them was also born a refugee. The baby's eyes are all lined with kohl, a tradition they believe will strengthen their sight and protect them from evil. Evil they've already seen. Catherine Zeltner, EWTN News Nightly.
Beautiful children. Thank you, Catherine. Bipartisan blasting today on Capitol Hill. Democrats and Republicans agree on one thing: GM made fatal mistakes. CEO Mary Barra was on the hot seat over the deadly car part problems. Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri challenged GM's chief lawyer, saying he was too slow in his response to the problems. The lawyer said that he learned about the ignition switch problems in February and acted quickly to fix the problem. Since February, GM has recalled millions of cars because of the faulty ignition switches. Blamed for a number of deaths, the car maker admits to knowing the problem for more than a decade. Also on Capitol Hill today, House Speaker John Boehner says he is losing optimism. He says Democrats and Republicans may not be able to agree on how to address the crisis on the U.S.-Mexico border. He says any legislation should include a change to a 2008 law he says is being abused. Democrats oppose that change. Congress will go on recess in less than 2 weeks. Should the government foot the bill to care for the tens of thousands of children illegally crossing into the U.S.? That was the focus of a recent Senate debate. President Obama wants billions in emergency aid to respond to the border crisis. Even as Congress mulls over the request, that tab is growing.
Senators were shocked at the figures of over $200 a day to provide for these young people that have illegally entered the United States. And it's a figure that I thought was shocking. In the whole room, you heard the murmuring. People were shocked at the costs associated with this.
The president's request includes $1.8 billion for temporary care for children now in government custody. Another $1.6 billion would go to bolstering customs and border efforts while cracking down on smugglers. So far, Republicans will not support the idea, and Democrats are divided on it. The ex-convict police say killed one priest and brutally beat another in a Phoenix rectory has pleaded not guilty. Gary Moran is charged with breaking into a rectory at a Phoenix Catholic church last month, killing Father Kenneth Walker. Moran was brought to court in a wheelchair today. He had very little to say. He is scheduled to be back in court on the 2nd of September. Coming up, a story illustrating the ethical concerns over in vitro fertilization. And can babies become addicted to electronic gadgets before they even walk? Tonight, a beautiful reflection from the Twitter feed of Pope Francis. The Church, by her nature, is missionary. She exists so that every man and woman may encounter Jesus. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Brian Patrick. Many couples experience the hardships of infertility. Some turn to IVF, in vitro fertilization, hoping to conceive. But using IVF poses grave moral problems. Consider this. Several media outlets report TV personality Sherri Shepherd recently announced she and her husband will have a baby. Now, this is complicated. They reportedly used a surrogate mother and another woman's eggs to conceive through IVF. Now, Shepherd and her husband are getting a divorce. Since Shepherd has no genetic ties to the baby, she reportedly wants nothing to do with the child. So we welcome back Mary Rice Hassan from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. First of all, we should point out the church prohibits IVF. What is church teaching on this?
Brian, IVF is always the wrong solution, but to a very real problem. So many couples suffer from infertility, and the church says, first of all, we need to approach them with compassion, with empathy, but also to offer them the solutions that there are church-approved ways to deal with infertility that actually have a track record at least as good as IVF. So that's one thing to realize. We need to have compassion for those couples. We need to offer them a better way. But IVF itself is immoral, and the basic principle is this: a child is a gift from God. given to us by God, and parents need to accept that child with unconditional love, whether it's a child with autism, Down syndrome, a difficult personality, whatever it may be. And IVF turns that on its head.
It's a manipulation of creation, isn't it?
It is, because what happens is parents say, I want a child, therefore I have a right to a child, and they take dominion over that creation of the child. And from there, they start to sort and select and decide what kind of a child they want. And there's a sorting process, very literally. It's almost as if parents become picky shoppers.
Yeah. Mary, would you give us just a quick example of a morally acceptable way to try to conceive?
Yes, there's something out there called NAPRO technology, which is an approach that is just burgeoning across the country as more and more doctors are trained in it. And there are different NAPRO technology centers across the country, Texas, New York, Virginia. And what they do is they actually try to address the cause of the infertility. Because most of the time when a couple has trouble conceiving and they walk into a fertility center, they say, all right, you've tried for 6 months, 9 months, let's go right to IVF. And NAPRO technology says, wait a minute, let's see if we can solve this problem.
Find out what's wrong.
Right.
You know, it just strikes me as we talk about this, what does a child face that is born this way when they find out later in life?
Yeah, here's the thing. So many Catholics say, but wait a minute, isn't this a pro-life thing? Because every child's a gift from God. But the problem is every child has a right to be conceived in the loving embrace of the mother and father. And so children who are conceived in IVF, and I've talked to a number of them, have a wound. Because no child, no human being should be conceived from the spare parts of individuals who really want nothing to do with them. And that's what happens. We're intentionally conceiving children without a mother and a father, but just from anonymous eggs, anonymous sperm.
It's very troubling, very important that we talk about it. From the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Mary Rice Hassan, thank you for being with us tonight. We're going to stick with babies here. Getting babies to eat what's good for them rather than what they want can often be a parent's greatest challenge. I know a lot of you can relate to this. Many doctors and scientists now believe their diet can affect how babies develop as children and even into adulthood.
The period of fetal life and infancy up to the age of about 2 years is a really critical period for the development of the brain. There's a huge amount of growth is going on in the brain, and we have very good evidence actually that adverse nutrition, generally lacking in nutrition or even lacking in specific nutrients, particularly iron, can have sometimes permanent effects on brain function.
Some of the foods and things on the market are absolutely fantastic because they're pure. You're just getting, the vegetables and the fruits and the things they need. And her idea of the best thing ever is a yogurt.
Yeah, yogurt's good. Working mom Stacy Carr says she shops for healthy food products that don't require a professional kitchen to produce, and yogurt would be one of those. And all the natural curiosity of babies means is that they often learn to use an iPad or a smartphone now before they can even walk. But scientists are beginning to investigate whether the preoccupation with screens and buttons and gadgets is having an impact on the behavior of our next generation. Parents might feel proud of their child's technological prowess, but experts say they should also be cautious of allowing it to become a habit.
These games and technologies have an addictive side to them, especially the games, because you want to go back for more. They're designed to get us to keep coming back and back and back, and lots of technology is designed to do that. And it will, in effect, trigger certain hormones in our bodies as well, the dopamine system, which drives us towards things all the time. But we're never quite satisfied.
Scientists say babies are naturally curious about what their parents are playing with, and they'll try to replicate it. They believe that's normal, but say too much screen time is just as problematic for babies as it can be for older kids. Microsoft announced the largest layoff in its history today. CEO Satya Nadella says the total of 18,000 jobs will be cut within the next year. That's about 14% of the 125,000 Microsoft employees. Nadella, who took over for Steve Ballmer in February, said Microsoft needs a culture change. Most of the layoffs come from Nokia's devices and services business, which Microsoft recently bought. Up next, a recap of today's top story. Hundreds of lives may have been lost in the downing of a passenger jet. Members of this family missed that doomed flight. They're blessed to be alive tonight. On Thursday, July 17th, we return to tonight's top story, a terrible plane crash. A Malaysian Airlines plane crashed in eastern Ukraine. The Boeing 777 may have been shot down. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 started in Amsterdam on its way to the Malaysian capital of Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia's Prime Minister says the plane did not make a distress call before going down. 295 people were on board. At least 22 bodies were counted at the crash scene. There appear to be no survivors. We go back to Jason Calvi at the White House. Jason, do we know were any Americans on board that flight?
Well, Brian, the vice president said he had heard those reports that Americans were indeed on board, but so far no confirmation either from the White House or the State Department, Brian, but we are looking to get some information for all of you tonight. We also did hear today from a family that was supposed to be on board that plane.
We were supposed to be in that flight, and it's obviously, you know, something is watching over us and say, no, don't get on that flight.
Brian, both groups still at this moment trading critiques of each other, placing blame on each side, Ukraine and Russia placing blame on the other for this incident. And I should say that the vice president said that it's no accident, and it looked like the plane had been blown out of the sky. Brian?
In fact, Jason, an eyewitness reports seeing what looked like a rocket actually strike that plane before it crashed in eastern Ukraine. We told you about the violence in Israel a little bit earlier, but that violence doesn't leave much room for fun and games. But for the national lacrosse team, their sport and their success are more than a diversion. Catherine Elliott has that story.
As bombs explode in their homeland, the Israel lacrosse team advances to the quarterfinals of the World Lacrosse Championships in Denver.
We talk about it every day, in team meetings, on the bus, on the way over there, in our huddles.
The national lacrosse team was started in 2010. Its quick rise in world rankings is tempered by rocket attacks from Gaza and deadly airstrikes.
Back home, it's such a tragic situation right now, and it's very complex. And we're hoping that unifying Israel, showing that we're playing here for the Arabs and the Jews. Like I said, shalom, salam. We cater to all kids back in Israel.
Israel forward Noah Miller coaches children's teams that include both Arabs and Israelis in Tel Aviv.
You know, you're a lacrosse coach in the United States. A parent may come up to you and say, what's your plan if there's thunder, inclement weather? When we're coaching, we have parents come up to you and say, what are you going to do if there's a rocket attack? What's your plan?
Israel's team is already missing some players whose lacrosse helmets have been traded for soldiers' helmets. And
myself and my teammate Matt Cherry will both be serving in the IDF.
It's not the life of most athletes in the U.S., but the Israel team is overcoming religious divisions with their sport.
Israel lacrosse is not just about Judaism, it's about anybody that's an Israeli citizen. And they can be Arabic, a Muslim, they can be a Catholic person. It is a foundation for creating peace.
Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. And finally tonight, our Susie Pinto has the heartwarming story of twin sisters who have now shared more than 100 years of life and laughter.
Helen Dominy on the left and Hazel Seaman have shared a lifetime of laughter. The identical twins have just turned 101 and continue to be inseparable.
I'd just be lost without her.
They grew up in a family of 11 children, so they learned early on about the value of family loyalty.
We always stick up for each other.
For years, they lived in two different communities, but now they live just blocks apart.
They went right into a giggle. As soon as they would see each other, they would consistently giggle.
So what's their secret to a long life?
I wish I knew.
It's a safe bet that laughter has something to do with it. Susie Pinto, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Susie. We really needed that tonight. And thank you for watching EWTN News Nightly. Please, let's keep the victims of the Malaysian Flight 17 and their families in our prayers tonight. And tomorrow, after morning mass here on EWTN, a special rosary prayed for them and for peace in the world. For all of us at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night and God bless you.